The United Nations General Assembly roundly condemns the blockade on Cuba with 187 votes to 3. Chile's health minister gets a more than warm reception. Hospital staff call him a murderer and tell him to leave. And the Springboks rugby heroes began their victory tour around South Africa. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo and this is From the South. We begin with news from Brazil, where the Supreme Court is voting on a case that could, in theory, see the former president Luis Inacio Lula da Silva released from prison. The judges have voted 5 for and 5 against the principle that defendants should not be in prison until all appeal processes have been completed. The decision now depends on the vote of the president of the court, Dias Toffoli. Some observers say he may adopt an intermediate position that would see several thousand other prisoners released, but not Lula. The 28th plenary session of the United Nations General Assembly has voted overwhelmingly to reject the economic, financial, and commercial blockade on Cuba. The resolution passed with 187 in favor, 3 against, and 2 abstentions. The United States, Israel, and Brazil voted against. Colombia and Ukraine abstained. The resolution condemns the United States' application of the Helms-Burton Act on Cuba. It expressed the need to respect the sovereignty of states and supported non-intervention policies as laid down in the United Nations Charter.
The result of the vote is as follows.
The Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez closed the debate with a detailed account of the impact of almost 6 decades of blockade on Cuba and the world. He began by condemning the U.S. government's recent tightening on these illegal measures.
During the last few months, President Donald Trump's administration has started to escalate aggression against Cuba through the implementation of non-conventional measures to prevent the arrival of fuel shipments to our country from different markets, by resorting to sanctions and threats against vessels, shipping companies, and insurance companies. The intent, apart from damaging Cuba's economy, is to harm the living standards of Cuban families. The United States government is responsible for announcing its decision in April this year to allow lawsuits to be filed before U.S. courts against Cuban and foreign entities under Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. Persecution of our banking and financial relations with the rest of the world has continued to intensify. Remittances sent to Cuban citizens have been restricted. The granting of visas has been reduced. Consular services have been limited. The agreement achieved between the baseball federations of both countries has been cancelled. Individual travel by American citizens has been stopped. Cruise ships travels as well as direct flights to Cuban airports, except for Havana's airport, were prohibited.
After explaining the inhumane consequences of restricting Cuba's access to drugs for cancer and other diseases, the Cuban Foreign Minister said the United States does not have the slightest moral authority to criticize Cuba or any other country over human rights.
In the world's richest country, 40 million Americans live in poverty. Of them, 18.5 million live in extreme poverty. At the end of last year, 25.7% of people with disabilities lived in poverty. More than 500,000 are homeless. Article 23, the right to work. In late 2018, there were 6.6 million unemployed in the United States. Article 25, the right to health. 28.5 million U.S. citizens lack health insurance, and millions of the lowest income persons will be left without it.
The Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza was one of the first to speak at today's session. He implored the United Nations to act in order to protect its own charter, quoting human poet Jose Marti, saying that actions are better than words.
We call for specific action to put an end to these inhumane policies which trample on the very spirit and body of the Charter of the United Nations, which are an aggression and affront to the United Nations. So that this organization can achieve its noble goals, as Jose Marti said. Action is better than words. Now we must act. The Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is a responsible member of the international community, and we will vote once again in support of Resolution A74L6 on the necessity to end the blockade against Cuba, and we call on the United States, once the resolution has been adopted, to comply with the provisions of this resolution and the undeniable principles as proved by the General Assembly.
Meanwhile, citing the negative extraterritorial impact of the blockade, Antigua and Barbuda's UN representative called for an end to the coercive measure imposed by the U.S.
Antigua and Barbuda consider Cuba as a legitimate member of our Western Hemisphere community and as a member of the Caribbean community family of nations. We call on the United States to cease the embargo, which has gone on far too long and has no useful purpose. We once again call on the United States and the government of Cuba to meet and find peaceful ways to bring about a relationship based on mutual respect and shared responsibility between the people of both neighboring nations.
Chile's major trade unions are calling for a general strike next Tuesday, the 12th of November. As protests continue in the capital and other cities, leaders of the dockers, shop workers, and miners' unions, all members of the CUT Federation, criticize the human rights violations committed by the forces of repression propping up the government of Sebastián Piñera. They called for popular unity and repeated the demand for a constituent assembly to bring fundamental changes to Chile.
It's going to be an historic day. The solidarity between workers is clear. We've been together mobilizing, and we have to come together as a society, beyond just as workers. We call on everyone to join us. Together we can work for the changes that the country needs.
We are an organization that counts on more than 40,000 members and more than 100 unions. We are with the CUT Federation. Unity is important to us above all. We call on the commercial sector and financial services not to wake that day.
We want to be clear that any talks, with whomever they may be, must stem from a basic respect for human rights. Human rights continue to be trampled on. Our kids are being shot while at school. This is something that needs to be addressed through a commission of justice and truth. We need to take control of the situation in the country. With respect to what we've spoken about and what we're in agreement on, a constituent assembly being called for by the people is a call coming from our communities, from our homes.
Doctors and nurses joined other social movements to march on the World Health Organization building in Santiago. They demanded that the organization speak out against human rights abuses and killings in the last 3 weeks of protest. They also want the WHO to look at the inequality in health provision in Chile.
In the face of the abuses that we have in the health system, we believe that international organizations must speak out on this. They must speak out about how today there is one kit of healthcare for rich people and another for poor people, and also how some people die waiting.
We will deliver what we as health officials and patients have collected in the community assemblies or cabildos that have been taking place throughout the country as proposals to really improve healthcare so it equals quality healthcare for all Chileans.
Earlier in the day, health workers confronted the Minister of Health when he visited the Salvador Hospital in the capital. They followed Jaime Manalich as he visited the wards and shouted, "Leave, leave." One of the protesters' placards called him a murderer in a white coat. Coming up after the break, demonstrators turned out in London to condemn the head of the OAS's visit to Britain. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. In Barbados, the way seems clear for the Mia Mottley administration to draw down its third installment of $50 million under a $300 million IMF loan. The money is intended to finance the island's economic recovery and transformation program. Mottley provided an update on the debt restructuring process after she met with an IMF delegation in Bridgetown.
2 days ago, we launched the external debt exchange, and that is expected to close by the end of this month. And I think that our ability to put behind us the debt restructuring exercise completely allows us to move fully into the next stage of the program, which is literally to complete the structural changes that we have in our regulatory structure to make it easier, not just to do business, but for Barbadians to enjoy services that are delivered to them on a daily basis. And then secondly, for us to focus completely on the projects that are necessary to be able to really do the transformation, be it the transformation of our people through the continuous training in the National Training Initiative over the next 4 years, or the physical infrastructural projects that are absolutely critical.
Guyana's government remains in interim mode until the March 2nd, 2020 general elections are held. This follows after last December's no-confidence motion was determined to have been validly passed. President David Granger assures that the government continues to adhere to the convention of a caretaker administration.
We have accepted that we are an interim administration. I, for one, apart from my health, I have not traveled to any international conferences for over a year. And we have not entered into any major agreements.
Since it came to office in 2015, Guyana's government has provided Christmas bonuses to public workers. But this year, there's no guarantee, as the president is awaiting advice on whether the funds are available to make the much-anticipated tax-free payout.
I'm not saying no, but after the next cabinet meeting, the Minister of Finance will be able to make an announcement on that matter.
Demonstrators have turned out in London to condemn the head of the Organization of American States on his visit to Britain. They say Luis Almagro was lying about human rights in Venezuela. Pablo Navarrete reports.
This Tuesday, several UK grassroots groups in solidarity with Latin America protested outside the talk given by the General Secretary of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, in London. Carrying Cuban and Venezuelan flags, the protesters gathered outside the entrance of a University of London building where the organisation Canning House had organised for Almagro to talk about human rights in Venezuela.
We think it is completely hypocritical to come here to talk about this subject when he and the organization he represents is responsible and promoting sanctions against Venezuela, which are creating suffering and poverty, the lack of food for millions of people, with grave consequences for the population in general. He has also supported and promoted a coup against the democratically elected president in Venezuela.
One of those at Almagro's talk was Venezuelan documentary maker Carolina Graterol, who was evicted from the event for challenging Almagro's statements on Venezuela.
I was clarifying some points that Almagro lied about in a speech, some of his inaccuracies. Then 3 security guards arrived to drag me out of the hall. I didn't resist at all and we left. They told me they would fetch my things. Then I was outside without my bag or my coat. But they never brought me anything. Luckily, somebody else went and got them for me.
Before Almagro's visit, the British MP Chris Williamson had tweeted that it was a sick joke that Almagro should speak about human rights in Venezuela and highlighted his support for US sanctions against the country. Hostility to Almagro's visit was present both inside and outside the hall. If Almagro thought his visit to the UK would pass quietly, he was wrong. Pablo Navarrete, Telesur, London.
On to Bolivia, where demonstrators gathered outside Congress in response to acts of violence and racism by opposition sectors. Women demanded justice after the town hall in Vinto was burned down and Mayor Patricia Arce was violently attacked. Protesters cut her hair and threw red paint at her. She was later rescued by the police. The attack took place after clashes between supporters and opponents of President Evo Morales, which have been taking place since the October 20th general elections, in which Morales won re-election. Violent opposition sectors have refused to recognize his victory.
I stand with the truth and I am not afraid of speaking it. I am in a free country, and if you want to kill me for this process of change, then I'm ready to give my life.
The Vice President of Bolivia, Álvaro García Linera, addressed the kidnapping of the mayor in a news conference earlier.
For these people, being a woman is a crime. For these people, being humble is a crime. For these people to wear the traditional indigenous skirt is a crime. This doesn't happen in a democracy. This is called fascism. That is fascism. Attacking women, attacking them for being indigenous, humiliating them, attacking social organizations. That's fascism. What Bolivia is facing now is a wave of fascism.
Coming up after the break, South Africa's national rugby team kicks off their nationwide victory parade. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. In Lebanon, hundreds of demonstrators have rallied outside the electricity utilities headquarters in Beirut as they continue to shine a light on corruption at state-run institutions. The nighttime protests erupted mere hours after outgoing Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri met President Michel Aoun but failed to announce any progress towards forming a new government. The anti-government protests are in their fourth week amid rising anger over the high cost of living, new tax plans, and corruption. While waving Lebanese flags and banging pots and pans, demonstrators voice their grievances.
I am protesting today because the electricity institution is one of the most corrupt institutions in Lebanon. And to get rid of this corruption, we will be protesting in front of all public institutions so we can shine a light on the corruption in these places, demand reform, the change of laws, and let the political elite know that their cards have been revealed and they need to work harder on these reforms.
The government resigned, but the streets' pressure is still as important as it was before the resignation of the government. Because this state is ruled, as soon as we leave the streets, it is ready to debate and argue over shares like before. We have so far realized many things from the streets.
French President Emmanuel Macron has described NATO as brain dead as a result of waning commitments from the United States. Macron told The Economist magazine that he believes there is a lack of strategic coordination between European allies on the one hand and the US and Turkey on the other. The French president warned European member countries that they can no longer rely on the United States to defend NATO allies. The French president drew fire for his remarks on NATO. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel said the alliance remains vital for security.
The French president has chosen drastic words. That is not my point of view regarding the cooperation with NATO. I think such a sweeping swap is not necessary. Even though we do have problems and have to sort ourselves out.
House Democrats will begin public hearings next week for the first time as they continue the impeachment inquiry into United States President Donald Trump. 3 State Department officials will be the first to testify. So far, key witnesses have given sworn statements behind closed doors. Democrats are seeking to remove Trump from office on claims that he pressured Ukraine to publicly announce an investigation into political rival Joe Biden and his son, Hunter Biden. With less than a week to go before the deadline for the formation of a government of national unity, South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar have met in Uganda to try to salvage the peace deal signed last year. The two rivals agreed last year to form a government of national unity by November 12th as part of efforts to end the 6-year conflict that has killed more than 300,000 people. However, their failure to agree on critical issues such as the composition of the army threatens to sink the deal. Former Congolese rebel leader Bosco Ntaganda will spend 3 decades behind bars for war crimes. Ntaganda, who served as military operations chief for the Union of Congolese Patriots, or UPC, rebel group, has been sentenced to 30 years in prison by the International Criminal Court for crimes, including murder, rape, and conscripting child soldiers. The majority of the crimes were carried out between 2002 and 2003 in the east of the country. The sentence is the longest that has been handed down by the court since the establishment in 2002.
You may sit down now. For rape of civilians as a crime against humanity and as a war crime, 28 years. For murder and attempted murder as a crime against humanity and as a war crime, 30 years. For persecution as a crime against humanity, 30 years of imprisonment.
In South Africa, hundreds of investors gathered in Sandton, Johannesburg for a 3-day conference to accelerate efforts to attract investment. The nation hopes to raise $100 billion in investment over the next 5 years.
President Cyril Ramaphosa welcomed delegates to the second South African Investment Conference held under the theme Accelerating Growth by Building Partnerships. The president promised potential investors that government will continue to remove hurdles to doing business in South Africa.
Through the expanding of network of Invest SA's one-stop shops, we are working to remove bureaucratic as well as administrative hurdles to investment. And this we're doing having had discussions with a number of you as investors and potential investors. We've taken steps and continue to take steps to remove all these hurdles and impediments.
Last year's conference saw pledges of over $20 billion worth of investment commitments, and this year also looks promising.
We will make the 1.2 trillion that the president has targeted in the next 5 years. We are quite confident we will be able to make that, so that we make, through those investments, we are able to create the much needed jobs for our young people. We are also able, through those investments, to grow our economy to respectable levels.
One of the groundbreaking investment commitments came in the automotive industry.
The Toyota company has announced that the first production of a hybrid vehicle on the African continent will take place here in South Africa. That is a combination of a car that is driven by an electric battery and petrol technologies. That's the car of the future.
The newly launched African Continental Free Area Agreement will also boost intra-African trade and create a market of around 1.3 billion people. Johan Abrams for Telesur in Johannesburg.
The victorious South African national rugby team have kicked off their nationwide victory parade. The team's open tour bus brought business to a standstill in Johannesburg's Central Business District as thousands of excited fans lined up the street to catch a glimpse of the world champions. In the next 5 days, the team will visit the country's largest cities, including Cape Town, Durban, and Port Elizabeth. And with that story, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Estefania Bravo. Until next time.